Welcome to Tech Ascent, the podcast where we dive into the trends, strategies, and success stories that are reshaping the tech landscape as we know it today. I'm your host, Oliver Clingain. I'm also the founder of Ascension, the primary biz development partner within tech. Today, we're joined by Troy Davis, the founder and CEO of Lampros Labs. Troy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Would you mind telling the audience a little bit about your background as well as what you do with Lampros Labs?
Sure. So I was one of the kids that got into programming really early on. I was 10 when I started programming on a Commodore 64. I'm dating myself, but I just never stopped programming. I kind of hit it during high school because it was kind of a dating liability. But by the time I was in college, I kind of let my geek flag fly. I had trouble saying that. And then ever since then, I've been very public about my programming since then. But yeah, so software development in general, I wound up getting a degree in electronic media from UC, University of Cincinnati, and which really was mostly about video and audio production, funny enough, but also advertising and marketing as well. But I really didn't want to study computer science because I had been programming for, I don't know, almost 10 years at that point by the time I went to college. Well, I guess 8. So I just didn't see a lot of utility in studying comp sci. I knew that there were things I could learn. There was definitely stuff in their textbooks because I looked through the textbooks, but just didn't decide to go that route. And I'm kind of glad I didn't. I got a different kind of education than a lot of folks in my field, and it's actually benefited me a lot. Started as just an employee for an ad agency right out of college. Worked for another ad agency after that, and that was about 15 years of my career total. Well, 12. The last couple of years were spent working on a startup that came out of one of the ad agencies. That's kind of where I got the startup bug from. So we had developed this little content management system, and suddenly we had like 100 customers using it, and we just didn't know how that happened. And suddenly we had an angel investor who wanted to fund a scale-up effort in order to be able to do these things faster and cheaper. So we spent about a year doing that, and then the economy fell apart. That was 2009, and startup went boom, and it was over. And I thought that was it for my startup experience, because who wants to work with somebody who was at a failed startup, right? It turns out a lot of people did, and I got a lot of calls after that about folks wanting me to help them, and I wound up being a serial CTO for about another 7 or 8 years, something like that, and built several different teams for a bunch of different companies that were all doing the same thing, trying to create technology, get an MVP out, persuade investors, and then find teammates and hire them as they had revenue for it. And after doing that, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 times, and then as soon as I stepped away from the company, I saw that the team blew up. They had a hard time keeping those teams together after I left. And I decided that it would be better to start a company where I would actually have my own team. And that sounded a lot better to me. And then I would figure out how to do the CTO thing as a component of that. And that's where Lampros Labs came from. It started out just hiring like college students to just do menial work, WordPress sites and simple HTML and that sort of thing. The projects just kept getting more and more complicated, and so we wound up hiring more and more experienced developers over time. And at this point, we're a small team. We were a lot bigger last year. We had a lot more work last year, but the professionalism and the experience level is way higher now for our team than it was, of course, when I started, when I didn't have a budget. So now we serve people in the nonprofit industry, we serve manufacturers, service businesses, and I still work with a lot of startups.
Awesome. And it sounds like you've got a real knack for kind of putting together teams through your experiences as a fractional CTO.
Forged by a lot of mistakes and learning what not to do. Yes. But yeah, I was asked to be in a leadership position really early in my career. I think just a year or two out of college. Not because I was necessarily the greatest candidate for a management position at that point, but because I was technically minded. I seemed friendly enough. I didn't really have the experience or the training at all, but that's something that I did pick up over time.
And along that journey, you mentioned it's forged by mistakes and experience. Obviously, sometimes that's hard to put a label on. What do you think are some of the biggest lessons you've learned throughout that journey? maybe
I
it
think
comes
one
down.
is that yeah, I mean there's several big ones. I think one of the biggest ones though was to understand that to understand the communication model a lot better. And what I mean by that is when people communicate with each other, there are all sorts of forms of interference and bias that are in play that muddy the message. And one of my jobs as a team lead is to unmuddy the message and to figure out what people really mean when they say certain words. Because a lot of times I think I know what they mean, but as soon as I asked them some clarification questions, I found out actually I did not know what they meant.
Hmm.
So unmuddying the message is one of the things I learned from that by a lot of hard mistakes. I think the other one really comes down to accountability is its own reward system. That when you hold people accountable to their work, they wind up taking more pride in their work and they wind up doing a better job at it. And it's not holding them accountable as though, it's not you're fired if you don't do this. It's really about this didn't work out the way we'd hoped. What did we do wrong? Let's do the analysis. Let's do the postmortem. Let's figure out what we should do better next time. You know,
I like that. No, especially I come from a background in sports, so accountability was always a massive aspect for us, especially in that team environment. So I'm fully on board with
there's
that
a
one.
lot of ways to there's a lot of ways to dodge accountability in my trade, and I'm not real thrilled about that. Especially when you're talking about the marketing folks. I don't know what it is, but when you do online marketing, like there's so little accountability, it's kind of scary. So
Yeah, no, it's a dangerous place, especially us kind of being in that where we put ourselves in the business development space. So it is marketing's a piece of that, but we see companies all the time. They promise the world and don't come close to delivering it.
yeah, yeah. Well, if you don't have any, I guess that's the other thing that I figured out was that the basic of SMART goals, right? Like you really need measurable in there. And one of the things that seems to be left out all of the time when people set goals is the measurability. So if you're going to have a business goal, figure out how you're going to measure the results to know if your spend is even worth continuing. You know, I can tell you how many people are spending money that I have as clients right now. They're spending money on Google ads. They have no idea if those Google ads are actually delivering any form of business results to them, but they are terrified of turning them off,
Yeah.
right? Afraid that this could be a major hit to their traffic, a hit to their sales, they could lose their jobs, etc. But, in what other venue do we think that fear is a good motivating factor for decision making?
No,
Yeah,
it's just
I'm not a supporter of
FOMO.
that idea. So yeah, so I keep telling clients that are in that situation, I'm like, you just need to quit cold turkey for a month and see what happens.
Mm.
You know, and it might hurt a little bit, but why do you keep engaging? And I mean, it's like what is the syndrome when you're hostage and you start sympathizing with your hostage taker? Let's say it was I don't know something syndrome, Munich syndrome or something. I don't remember now.
I'm not too
Something up
sure,
that alley.
but no, I get the concept.
Not that I want to call Google a hostage taker necessarily. I think they're just an unethical ad purveyor, but that's a different issue.
And in such a speaking of marketing, Troy, in such a competitive landscape, such as kind of software development, how do you go about breaking through that noise with Lampros Labs?
I think a lot of it has to do with actually just being involved in other things outside of selling my company. Because if I spend all of my time just trying to sell my company, I get very limited results. But if I spend my business development time instead assisting other organizations that need help doing X, Y, and Z that has a public good of some kind, usually it's something around the business community, but it's like helping students of that community, or it's assisting new startups and helping mentor them. That turns out to be a much more effective way for me to get business than for me to try to sell directly to clients. But I think it also goes in hand with I don't know if you can be a software developer and sell direct to your clients anymore. The projects are too short and the sales cycles are too long. It used to be that the projects were a lot bigger, a lot longer, more money involved, and now they're shrinking a lot. Part of that's because of increases in efficiency. Everybody's using AI to help code faster, so we can build a lot more, a lot faster. People haven't embraced that enough yet where they're like, oh, well, you mean I could get 10 times more functionality with the same budget I used to spend on something? They're not going there. They're like, oh, I can save 90% on the same thing that I already wanted. yeah, both are true, right?
Hmm.
So I think we'll probably see a bounce back effect because right now I think there's a lot of folks playing with no code tools and trying to use AI to build systems of their own. And if they're using AI like I do, which I use it every day while I'm doing my work, you find out that it's really helpful, but it does not close the circle for you. It will not help you figure out the details. It cannot get out of its own way sometimes, and it gets stuck in feedback loops where it can't figure out how to get out of the sequence of events that are happening and figure out how to end them.
Hmm.
So, you know, I feel for a lot of the people that are out there right now trying to build apps themselves using AI or no code tools or whatever, because you can make some early wins real easy and get some early wins. It's the later wins that become really, really difficult.
Hmm. For sure. And obviously, you even touched on it's AI has caused such a, even call it a tectonic shift in the software development
Yeah.
space. You mentioned you do use it daily in some capacity. What does that kind
Oh
of
yeah.
look like for you?
Well, I mean, I'm very cognizant of what the limitations of it are. You know, the the guardrails that are set up around AIs are a form of bias, usually very beneficial. But for instance, if you've got somebody who runs a chemical company and they need an AI that can talk to them intelligently about how chemicals interact with each other, then you can't use most commercial AIs right now because they have guardrails to prevent you from talking about those sorts of things. Because if you talk about something that's explosive or puts off toxic fumes or something, that's off limits. Well, if you're a chemist, you need to be able to talk about those things.
Right.
So it's interesting that the way that we are making AI safe for the public is actually making it more difficult to use in a lot of professional settings, right? Because we need different kinds of guardrails. You know, for the chemist, I would want to try to restrict the conversation to chemistry topics entirely. And if they ask for anything outside of that, just say, I'm sorry, I can't help you, go somewhere else,
Hmm.
right? That would be an appropriate guardrail. But I don't need guardrails around, unsafe substances because we need to talk about those in this
Right.
context, right?
Hmm.
But I mean, for my own personal use, I mean, I use it as a coding assistant. It generates a lot of code that is mostly usable, and I correct it and figure out what's wrong with it, and then it is usable at that point. So that speeds up my production time a lot. That's nice. I'll use it to brainstorm on things too, because it does have pretty good understanding of the research that's been done on the internet for lots of different kinds of topics. So I think a lot of people use it as a research tool now as well. Helpful to keep in mind that it's not the most up to date thing in the world. Their indexes are dated. So if you want the latest information, you're going to have to follow up on whatever you get from the AI yourself and do a little bit more research on your own for newer information that might exceed what you've learned.
Hmm.
And then I guess, there's the intentional bias stuff that's a little tricky too. And saw that with DeepSeek right when it came out and tried, an open llama version of that. Ran it locally on my laptop, and I was just stunned at how intense the censorship was. And there's this whole theory about how there's a guard program that once it sees a prompt being written about something about a sensitive topic, then the security guard wipes the response and puts in a state-sponsored message instead, right? But I was running a local copy of it, and it had the censorship built into the model directly. There was no external communication happening with some other service that was acting as that guard.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure if that theory is true, but it made me think twice about whether or not I actually wanted to use X.AI at all. And I've decided I don't want to. Mostly because I know that it's going to come with all of the biases that Elon Musk once programmed into it. And quite honestly, I just don't trust his consciousness enough to make any decisions that would be useful to me.
It's understandable.
So if I think that's one of the things we're going to have to start watching for is I've got a feeling, and here I am, I'm developing AI systems of my own for several different projects, and I'm becoming acutely aware that my biases creep into them. And, not that I want to, I'm trying to prevent my bias from creeping in, but it's virtually impossible to keep it from having some of your bias, right? Just the way that you word things, the way you sequence your words, the way that you put emphasis on things, it is going to have an effect on the outcome.
Hmm.
And that's a little disturbing because it's interesting though because it has put me in a frame of mind often where I try to think about how to debias my thoughts. How do I take what I want to ask and rephrase it so that it has less bias attached to it? How can I make this more open-ended and not as not as much of a binary choice, for instance, right? When it might not necessarily be a binary choice. The false dichotomy situation, right?
Yeah.
There's a bias involved in just believing that there's only two choices in a situation when there might be more.
And I'm not sure of the
Yeah,
exact prompt, but if you go on a platform like ChatGPT, whichever one you use the most of, and you
I
ask
use
it to kind
GPT
of
the most. Yeah.
critique yourself, it'll do it, and
Oh
it'll
yeah.
be like
Oh yeah.
pretty hardcore. Like it's got
Oh
memory
yeah.
of, like you said, the way you word things, the way you respond to things, the way you ask things of it, and it learns a lot about you over time if you use it enough.
When I started using it because I developed a scoring system for one of the startups I work with to basically evaluate startup founders and see what their strengths and weaknesses are.
Hmm.
And I found that there were three politeness levels that I needed to work with on this. Because there is the newest student entrepreneur who you really don't want to discourage, and you need to tell them about their strengths and a little bit about where their weaknesses are and what they can do to improve them. But you got to really emphasize all of the strengths, right? Because otherwise, you're going to discourage that student, and they're just going to want to get out, and they won't pursue it any further. There's a middle road, which is kind of the constructive criticism route, and that one will balance kind of some positive feedback about things that you're good at, but it'll also focus on the things that it thinks you need improvement in. And it'll give more detailed reasoning behind why and what you need to do. And then there's the angry investor version. And the angry investor version is just looking at you as a liability. And it is doing a risk analysis on you to determine whether or not you're just going to screw this all up and lose all their money. And that is really harsh. Ran that on myself and I had a big sad for a little while. I had to go take a break for a little bit. So, yeah, turning the tools back on yourself is not always comfortable either.
It's too close to home.
Well, sometimes, yeah.
But no, Troy, in terms of this, obviously you've been in the tech space for quite some time now. Do you think the influx of AI, do you think it's been a positive or negative effect so far? And what do you think it's going to be later down the line?
I, I would say that it's both and neither at the same time, in the sense that AI is just like every other kind of technology tool that we've ever developed. It depends on what you use it for as to whether it helps or hurts, right? And that helps or hurts could be people, companies, environment, whatever. I mean, all of those things. But I think there's a difficulty with AI in the sense that we want to simultaneously give it way more credit than it deserves, but we also vastly underestimate its utility. It kind of reminds me of some statement I heard one time about new technologies, that every new technology is overhyped at the beginning and underestimated in the long term, right? And I think it's kind of the same thing here. We have built up such a crazy expectation around what we think AI should be capable of doing, and honestly, it's not really capable of most of that yet. It could be in some time, but it's just not there yet. But we're downplaying what the long-term impacts of this really are, because I think it's going to be a huge long-term impact. Short-term, it's not changing a whole lot in the world, although, I mean, like I said, business has changed for my company pretty significantly since ChatGPT went public. That's because there's a lot of people trying to do what we used to do for them as a service, and they're trying to do it on their own. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Made me shift my business model a little bit, but ultimately, they're going to have the same experience that we as developers have with AI, which is it's really good at some things, and then it starts falling short, and you can't figure out why it doesn't know, and you can't. And unless you're a developer, you're not going to be able to fix your problem.
Mm-hmm.
So, I do think that ultimately we are going to have fewer developers in the world, but we were already trending in that direction anyway. I think we went through a period where we had so many developers in the world that it probably didn't make a lot of sense anyway.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's a great way to look at it, and obviously, I'm not asking you to predict the future, but I do appreciate the insights. I think we share a very similar kind of mindset on it. people do
Yeah.
overestimate it, but it can also just as easily be underestimated if you don't kind of take it into account now.
It's in different ways, though, right? Like, I think the underestimation is going to come around just how much this is going to impact us in ways that we don't expect. Like, a lot of people are already using AI to filter through resumes, right? Well, guess what? That AI has a bias. Every AI does. So, if you want to talk about whether or not you are controlling your bias well enough, well, do you know? Have you tested your AI to see what kind of bias it has when it's selecting candidates? Have you asked it for reasoning about why it chose one candidate over another? Because you should know. You should know what biases it has. And if you can correct those biases to something more favorable, you should. But I think we're kind of going into an autopilot mode right now where a lot of people are going to have their lives very much affected by AIs that have not been thought about very much about what their biases are.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting, and obviously, there's no way to predict how it plays out, but some sort of
No.
change is definitely coming.
Yeah, I wish I could see that. You know, the microscope ball's been out of service for a long time. But it is interesting, though. There are some things that I think are relatively unavoidable at this point. You know, like, not that this is necessarily future casting in any way, but it's hard to imagine that we will pull back from AI and decide that it's not a useful tool. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're just going to keep developing and pushing harder and getting it to do more things. And, it already can, it depends on the model, but some of the models can pass, bar exams now. Some of them can diagnose illnesses better than doctors now. Some of them are better at coding than especially, entry level programmers at the moment. Well, I mean, those all are going to have effect on all of us. We may very well see that, there will be downward, I think, pressure on wages for doctors in the future too. Because, if the AI is more successful at accurately diagnosing someone, then why would I want to pay a flawed human to do it instead? You know,
Yeah.
I don't have a horse and buggy for sentimental reasons, right? I have a car that's more efficient than a horse and buggy. So
Yeah.
economics drives those decisions, and regardless of how you feel about the situation, economics always seems to win as the key concern.
No doubt. And yeah, I completely agree. It's here to stay. It's solidified itself just enough that I don't think people are going to be pulling away from it anytime soon.
Well, and we've been developing AI for 40, 50 years, right? I mean, the AI has been in development since I was a baby. And I've been tracking this throughout my career too, and I've used different kinds of AI throughout my career for different purposes. Text summarizers were one of the earliest ones that were available to me in the 90s. The text summarization was, I think, probably about as good as what you can get out of ChatGPT now. You know, so text summarization as a technology hasn't really improved all that much, not in 20, 25 years. But a lot of the other things that it can do, way better. I mean, I think it's also interesting that, AI vision was one of the earliest things we really figured out how to get right and run it on fairly, humble hardware without a lot of processor cycles on it. But you can, use a little Raspberry Pi and it can run, AI vision software on it, and it can recognize objects and faces and, animals and everything else. And it's quite quick at it. And that's a, pretty constrained resource situation where you've got a Raspberry Pi. There's very little power and not a lot of CPU cycles to spare. But the vision detection stuff works great. But that's partially because it was one of the first AI areas where we really focused a lot of time and money and investment, and we've really optimized that code base. I think we'll do the same thing with LLMs over time. But right now, I think we're still working through the Frankenstein phase. We're still trying to figure out how to get it to behave like a real boy. You know?
Yeah, yeah. No, and definitely there's pros and cons to each. We say AI, but it's across so much different types of technology. We're
A
bundling it
lot
up,
of
but
different.
there's so many different variations and different things underneath that kind of hood. So,
I think that's one of the things where I'm a little stunned sometimes that I see a lot of people trying to use LLMs to do predictive modeling. And they're not very good at that. I mean, they're actually pretty terrible at it. And I don't know why but that's a really common thing. I see people trying to use an LLM to take data and then project the future. They don't seem very good at that. There's better, I mean, there's machine learning and the neural networks and these sorts of things. These are way better at taking a good data set and then projecting, extrapolating what should happen in the future. They're way better at that than an LLM is. But we're putting a lot of weight on the probabilistic outcomes of LLMs, which I don't think is very wise at this point. I do think that we're going to wind up with kind of like an AI complex at some point. I mean, we're already seeing some kind of components like that. Cloudflare has like 25 different AI models for all different purposes you can use in their network, and Bedrock under AWS is unifying a whole bunch of different AI models and AI structures. And I do think that eventually we're going to have kind of hybrid AIs that will be using machine learning, vision, plus LLMs, plus probabilistic, and it'll be all kind of hidden from the user as to how all of those systems interwork. But that kind of multimodal approach to resolving questions or detecting something or doing research or that sort of thing, I think those are going to be really powerful in the future, and outpace what we're doing today by leaps and bounds. Certainly.
Yeah, no, there's.
I still don't think we'll be in. I still don't think we'll be in general AI anytime soon, though. I don't think that's going to happen. It's going to be a while.
There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. And Troy, we can switch lanes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually. I'm kind of curious. Based on your experiences with the LLMs, I mean, where do you see them kind of on? If you wanted to think about it from amoeba to insect to mammal to human or something on the scale of intelligence, where would you put AI right now?
That's a tough question. I do think there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of different kind of sectors within that. I do think it's growing. I think it's one of those bit of a buzzword at the moment. People are throwing around LLMs. Not everybody knows what they're talking about, and I'm not claiming myself to be an expert on it, so I don't want to overpredict, overspeak, but I do think there's a lot of room to grow, and I do think it's only going to keep improving, but at the point, kind of like you said, it's not fully where it needs to be or where people truly think it is. So,
yeah, I guess if I wanted to throw my view out there, I'd say that LLMs right now are probably somewhere on the bug level. I don't think they're at like hive mind level like honeybees or ants, but I think they're probably like solo bees or I don't know, walking sticks or something like that. I think that's kind of the parallel intelligence. It just takes us millions of dollars to emulate a walking stick's intelligence right now.
yeah, yeah, I can get behind that. I think it's on the bug level. I think, yeah, I do think if compounding effects take over the next, we'll say it's like 8 to 10 years, then I think they can really scale. But I think at that point, they're bugs. But hopefully the
I think
robots don't come and get me later down the line.
Yeah, I think we're still a way off from dog level intelligence. We still got a lot to go. But I think we'll probably see that in our lifetimes, though. I'm pretty sure. I don't know about general AI, though. I'm not sure if that's really within the timeline that you and I would find reasonable, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Switching lanes off of AI, Troy, but still looking at the future. What's the goals? What's the vision? What's the mission for Lampros Labs going forward?
Well, we've spent all of the time that we've worked together helping our customers build better products and thinking harder about them before you actually start building. I think the planning phase of software development is the one that's always shortcut because everybody wants to get to writing code and seeing features and doing iterations. And I think there is a lot of value to, once you have a clear concept, to quickly iterating. That's how you build a good startup. But you have to start with a clear vision of what it is you're building. And I think, if anything, what we're experiencing right now in the software development industry is a whole lot of people trying to figure out how to do that planning process independently. And it's tough. It is not a simple thing. It can take a decade or more to learn how to successfully plan a software development project. And regardless of how much AI help you have, I just don't think you're going to get there independently yet. So you could probably make an MVP style application, right? Minimum viable product. You could probably get there with an AI as an independent person without programming experience. I don't know if you can get much beyond that, though.
No, makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. And for the rest of 2025, what do you want to see happen with your company in terms of growth, in terms of just what's the goal?
Yeah, I think like last year or the last couple of years, we had become a little bit too overly dependent on one really large customer. And that hurt when that customer naturally matured, and it was a startup company, and they hit revenue, right? They started making revenue. That was the whole point. But once they started making revenue, the next thing on their list is hire their own developers, right? So that means it was time for me to go. And that's fine. That was what we were heading for, and I'll count that as a success. But by being so tied up with such a busy, big customer, we really did not have time, and I did not have time to focus on anything else for a couple of years. So as soon as that work was gone, there was a whole, oh man, what are we doing now? You know? So I think business continuity for me is probably the big goal for 2025, to develop a more sturdy method for pacing the work coming in, rather than it sometimes it's not quite a feast or famine. It's more like dinner or ridiculous feast kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
I just like to find the happy place where we get dinners most of the time and we get the feast sometimes, right?
Right.
But we had a feast for like 2 solid years. It was tough. Everybody winds up walking away from the table not feeling so good.
Food coma.
Something like that. The tryptophan kicks in.
No, gotcha. No, and it sounds like, Troy, from what we've gathered in this conversation, it sounds like you've got a great vision for the company. You understand your stuff, you know your stuff, and I look forward to supporting you guys from the sideline, and I think you guys can make whatever goals you guys have happen.
Well, thank you, Oliver, and thank you for this opportunity to be here. I've heard a lot of really good things about Tech Ascent, and looking forward to learning more about you guys too.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you, Troy. And for anybody listening, if you want to check out Troy or Lampros Labs, I'll link them down in the description so you guys can go check them out. Thanks for tuning in, and Troy, thank you once again for coming on.
Thank you, Oliver.